Rain hammered the windshield the night everything changed forever. A taxi door opened. My whole life shifted. "Where to?" she asked. I forgot the address. Her eyes held mine longer than they should have. I told no one about that ride. Until now. Weeks later. A secret threatened to destroy everything I had built. Someone I trusted chose to betray me instead. Would I choose safety? Or would I finally choose her? My name is Maren Whitfield, 29. An English teacher at a private Catholic school in Cincinnati, Ohio. Raised to never question the rules I was given. I never imagined that one rainy October night, one taxi ride, would force me to finally ask who I really was beneath every rule I had followed. The rideshare app glitched twice before a car finally accepted my request outside the restaurant where my mother's dinner had left me exhausted and hollow. A beat-up green sedan pulled to the curb, wipers struggling against the downpour, headlights cutting through sheets of rain like something out of a memory. The driver leaned over and unlocked the door herself, since the automatic lock was broken, and apologized before I even climbed inside, dripping and cold. "Sorry. It's been one of those nights," she said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror with eyes the color of strong coffee, warm and tired. Her name tag read Danielle Reyes. According to the app, 27. 4.9 stars. 6,000 rides completed across the city. I told her the cross streets near my apartment, and she nodded, merging into traffic with the calm confidence of someone who had driven these roads 1,000 times. Neither of us spoke for the first few blocks. Just the wipers ticking and the radio playing something low and forgettable beneath the drum of rain. Then she asked, out of nowhere, if I was okay. Because I looked like someone who had just left a funeral instead of a dinner party. I laughed, surprised, and told her it might as well have been one, considering how my mother had spent the evening listing reasons I should marry Tyler Grant. Danny snorted and said she'd take a funeral over her own family dinners any day. And something about her honesty cracked the tight knot in my chest. We talked the rest of the ride about nothing important, and everything important. The kind of conversation that stretches 12 minutes into something that feels like an hour. When she pulled up outside my building, I didn't want to get out. And for one strange second, neither of us reached for the door handle. I told myself it meant nothing. A friendly driver. A lonely night. Nothing worth thinking about twice. But I found myself checking the app the next morning anyway. 3 days later I saw her name pop up again on a ride request from my school. And I canceled and rebooked twice just to make sure it was her. She recognized me instantly, grinning in the mirror, and said the universe apparently thought we needed to finish our conversation about terrible family dinners. That ride turned into a habit, and habits turned into texts, and texts turned into her waiting outside the coffee shop near school, even when she wasn't working. Danny was in her second year of an accelerated nursing program, driving nights and weekends to cover tuition her family couldn't afford after her father's shop closed. She talked about her patients in clinicals like they mattered to her more than her own exhaustion, and I found myself falling for that kind of care. I started grading papers in the passenger seat while she waited between fares, both of us pretending it was only convenience, never naming what it actually was. One night she taught me how to parallel park in an empty lot, laughing so hard at my third failed attempt that she had to lean against the hood. I laughed too. Really. In a way I hadn't in years. And when our hands brushed on the gear shift, neither of us pulled away right away. My best friend and colleague, Priya Chandran, teased me about my mysterious new friend, who kept texting during lunch, and I brushed it off, too scared to name it. At home, my mother, Diane, mentioned Tyler Grant again over the phone, reminding me his family had money and stability, everything a Whitfield daughter should want. I sat with the phone against my ear, watching a text from Danny light up my screen, and felt the two halves of my life pulling apart. Danny never pushed me to explain anything about myself, which somehow made me want to explain everything. Slowly. In pieces. over weeks of rides in quiet parking lots. I told her about my father's death when I was 19, and how my mother had gripped tighter to tradition ever since, as if rules could hold grief together. She told me about her own father, still alive but proud in a way that made vulnerability feel dangerous, and how nursing school was her way of proving herself. We started meeting outside of rides, at a diner near the hospital that stayed open all night, sharing pie and stories until the sun came up some mornings. I began noticing small things, how she always let me pick the music, how she remembered I hated cilantro, how she watched me when she thought I wasn't looking. One evening, walking her back to her car after the diner, I realized I was hoping, quietly and fiercely, that she would kiss me before we reached it. She didn't. Not that night. But she squeezed my hand and said, "I like this. Whatever this is. I hope you do too," before driving away. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time after her taillights disappeared, feeling something crack open in my chest that I had kept sealed for years. The school. I started catching myself smiling at nothing, and Priya noticed, cornering me at the copy machine to ask who exactly was making me glow like that. I deflected, said it was just a good week, but the lie tasted strange in my mouth, heavier than any lie I'd told before. Danny began leaving small things in the cab for me, a granola bar, a folded napkin note, a playlist titled simply for the funeral girl, and I saved every one. On my birthday, she picked me up off the clock, no meter running, and drove 2 hours to a lake she used to visit as a kid. We sat on the hood of her car watching the sunset, and she finally reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. Slow and certain. "Can I kiss you?" she asked. And I nodded before she even finished the sentence, my heart pounding louder than the crickets around us. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, then warmer. And when we pulled apart, she laughed nervously and asked if that had ruined our friendship. I told her it hadn't ruined anything, that it felt like the first honest thing I'd done in years. And she pulled me close again. Driving home that night, windows cracked, radio low. I felt lighter than I had in a decade, like a door inside me had finally swung open. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Priya. I told no one. Because for the first time something felt too precious to risk explaining. Danny and I settled into something quiet and real. Dinners at her cramped apartment, study sessions at my kitchen table, Sundays spent doing absolutely nothing together. She met my cat, Faulkner, named after the author I taught every fall, and declared him the only Whitfield she fully approved of. I met her roommate, Belle, who took one look at us and said it was about time Danny brought someone home who made her actually smile. For 6 weeks, my life felt split cleanly into two halves, the daylight world of lesson plans and family obligations, and the nighttime world that belonged only to us. I told myself I would find the right moment to tell my mother. Some calmer day. Some easier conversation. Always pushing the truth a little further away. Danny never pressed the issue, though I noticed sometimes she'd go quiet after I mentioned another Sunday dinner I couldn't skip at my mother's house. "I'm not ashamed of you," she said once, carefully. "I just don't know if you're ashamed of me, or of this. And I need to know the difference." I promised her I wasn't ashamed, that I just needed time, and she nodded, though something in her eyes told me time wasn't the only thing worrying her. Essie. Agnes. The fall semester picked up speed, and I buried myself in essays and rehearsals for the school play, grateful for the distraction it offered. Priya started asking more pointed questions. Noting how often my phone lit up with messages, I quickly turned face down on my desk. "You know you can tell me anything," she said one day. And for a second I almost believed her enough to actually try. Instead I changed the subject, and she let it go, though the look on her face told me she wasn't fully convinced by my excuses. Danny picked up extra shifts to save for a laptop she needed for clinical documentation, and I started writing with her just to have more time together. We fell into an easy rhythm. Her driving. Me reading case studies aloud to help her study. Both of us stealing glances at red lights. One rainy night, almost exactly 1 year after our first ride, she pulled over near the lake again and told me she loved me. Plainly. Without ceremony. I said it back without hesitation, surprising myself with how easily the words came after months of guarding every feeling so carefully. For a while, it felt like nothing could touch what we had built between the taxi seats and diner booths and quiet Sunday afternoons. I should have known that kind of happiness rarely goes unnoticed for long, especially not in a life built on secrets stacked upon secrets. The first crack came from an unexpected place. Tyler Grant, my mother's chosen suitor, showed up at a school fundraiser I couldn't avoid without questions. He cornered me by the punch bowl, and instead of the usual small talk, he said quietly, "I know you're seeing someone. A woman. I saw you two at the lake." My stomach dropped, and I braced for blackmail, but instead he admitted something I never expected. He was gay too, and his family didn't know either. "I need a fake fiancé as much as you need cover," he said, half joking, half desperate. "Marry me on paper, and we both get our families off our backs." I refused immediately, telling him I wouldn't build my life on another lie, no matter how convenient. But his offer planted a seed of fear I couldn't shake. If Tyler had noticed us at the lake, someone else could notice too. And the thought of my mother finding out from a stranger terrified me more than confessing myself. I told Danny about the encounter, and her face tightened in a way I hadn't seen before, somewhere between anger and quiet hurt. "So your solution to people finding out is marrying a man?" she asked, and I realized how badly I had explained it, panicking instead of reassuring her. We had our first real fight that night. Not loud, but cold. Both of us retreating into our own corners of fear instead of reaching for each other. She dropped me home in silence, and I lay awake replaying every word, terrified I had already damaged the one true thing in my carefully divided life. At the same time, Danny's own family pressure intensified. Her mother, Elena, had arranged for her to have dinner with Marcus Alvarez, a family friend's son. "It's not a proposal. It's just dinner," Danny insisted when I asked, though the tightness in her voice told me it wasn't quite that simple. Elena Reyes had never openly asked Danny about her sexuality, operating instead on a fragile unspoken agreement that certain things simply weren't discussed at the family table. Danny admitted she'd never come out to her parents, terrified of losing the tight-knit family that had supported her through nursing school against the odds. I realized then that we were both hiding for different reasons, but hiding all the same, and neither of us had a map for what came next. We agreed, tentatively, to keep moving forward together, promising honesty even when it was hard, though the promise felt fragile against the weight of both our families. Back at school, Priya finally found a text on my phone left open during a faculty meeting, a message from Danny that ended with 3 small hearts. Her face changed instantly, surprise flickering into something harder to read, and she excused herself without a word, leaving me sick with dread for the rest of the day. That evening she called, voice careful, and asked directly if I was involved with a woman, since our school's contract included a morality clause about personal conduct. Confirmed it, bracing for judgment, but instead Priya sighed and said she just needed time to process it, promising she wouldn't say anything to anyone. I wanted to believe her, and for 2 weeks, nothing happened. No rumors, no whispers, and I let myself relax into a dangerous, false sense of safety. Meanwhile, Danny's dinner with Marcus went ahead as planned, and she came to my apartment afterward looking drained, admitting his family had all but announced an engagement timeline. I told him no, she said quickly, seeing my face. But my mom cried, and I didn't correct her when she assumed I'd said maybe. I understood the impossible position she was in, but a small, ugly fear crept in anyway. The fear that when it came down to it, she might choose her family's approval. We had another argument, quieter this time. Both of us exhausted from carrying separate weights that were somehow supposed to fit together seamlessly. "I'm not choosing him," she said, gripping my hands. "I just don't know how to lose my whole family the way I'm afraid you might lose yours." Her honesty disarmed my anger, and I pulled her close, both of us crying a little, admitting for the first time how frightened we both actually were. We decided together that we needed a plan, some clearer path forward. Instead of drifting through fear and hoping the truth would somehow announce itself gently, I began quietly looking into other teaching positions at schools without restrictive morality clauses, private and public, in case Agnes ever became impossible to stay at. Danny started researching nursing programs in cities farther from her family, telling herself it was only research, though I suspected she was preparing an exit too. Then, 3 weeks later, everything I feared happened at once, starting with a phone call from the school board chair, Richard Boone, requesting a private meeting. He didn't say why, only that concerns had been raised about my conduct outside of school, and my hand shook so badly I dropped my coffee mug. I immediately suspected Priya, though I desperately hoped I was wrong, hoped there was some other explanation for how the board suddenly knew anything at all. Danny drove me to the meeting, waiting in the parking lot the whole time, refusing to leave even when I told her she didn't have to. Inside, Richard Boone slid a printed photo across the table, me and Danny at the lake, taken from a distance, clearly by someone who had followed us. "A parent forwarded this," he said carefully, "along with concerns about the example you're setting for our students under the terms of your contract." I sat frozen, unsure whether to deny, explain, or simply walk out, every possible response feeling like it would only make things worse than they already were. "Is this true?" he asked directly, and something in me, exhausted from months of hiding, finally refused to shrink any smaller than I already had. "Yes," I said quietly. "I'm in a relationship with a woman, and I'm not going to apologize for who I love to keep this job." Boone's expression didn't soften, and he explained the school would need to review my contract, effectively suspending me pending a formal decision from the board. I walked out in a daze, and Danny met me halfway across the parking lot, catching me as my legs finally gave out from under me. "Who did this?" asked, though some sick part of me already knew. Already suspected the friend I had trusted with my most guarded secret. I called Priya that night, and after a long, guilty silence, she admitted it. She'd been afraid the board would question her too, by association, and panicked. "I'm sorry," she kept repeating, but the words felt hollow against the weight of what her fear had cost me in a single anonymous envelope. I hung up without forgiving her, not out of cruelty, but because I simply didn't have room left to hold anyone else's fear alongside my own. News of the suspension spread quickly through the small, tightly connected community Agnes served, and my mother heard it from a church friend before I could call her. She showed up at my apartment that night, face pale, asking if it was true, and I realized this was the moment I could no longer delay. "Yes, Mom," I said, standing straighter than I felt. "I love a woman, and I'm done pretending otherwise just to make your world easier." My mother didn't yell, which somehow felt worse than if she had. She simply went quiet, staring at me like she was seeing a stranger. "After everything I taught you," she said finally, "after everything we built, this is what you choose to throw it away for." I told her I wasn't throwing anything away, that I was finally choosing honesty over a life built on other people's comfort instead of my own truth. She left without another word, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had in 29 years of careful, controlled conversations. Danny found me on the kitchen floor an hour later, and instead of saying anything, she simply sat down beside me and held my hand until I could breathe evenly again. "I'm scared I just lost everything," I admitted, and she pulled me against her shoulder, whispering that whatever happened, I hadn't lost her. Not without a fight. The following week, the school board scheduled a formal hearing, and word spread that several parents were planning to speak both for and against my continued employment. Priya, racked with guilt, offered to speak on my behalf, but I told her honestly I wasn't ready to accept help built on the very betrayal that started this. Meanwhile, Danny's mother finally confronted her directly, having heard rumors through the tight community grapevine that connected both our very different worlds more than we realized. Is it true you're seeing a teacher? A woman, Elena asked, voice trembling. Danny, exhausted from months of hiding, simply said yes. Unable to lie anymore either, Elena didn't speak to her for 3 days, and Danny stayed at my apartment, both of us bracing separately for verdicts we couldn't control or predict. On the 4th day, Danny's father, Hector, called her. And instead of anger, he asked quietly if this was why she'd always seemed happier lately, more herself. Danny cried on the phone, admitting everything. The fear, the relief, the months of carrying a secret that had grown too heavy to hold alone anymore. Hector said he needed time, but that he loved his daughter regardless, a small mercy that gave Danny something solid to stand on while everything else shook. Elena remained distant, still processing, still grieving the version of her daughter's future she had quietly planned for years without ever asking Danny what she wanted. I watched Danny navigate her own family's earthquake while still showing up for mine, and I realized how much strength it took her to hold both of us up. The night before my hearing, couldn't sleep, rehearsing what I would say, terrified that no words could undo the damage already done to my career and reputation. Danny sat with me at my kitchen table until 3 in the morning, helping me organize my thoughts, refusing to let me convince myself I deserved to lose this fight. You've spent your whole life making yourself smaller for other people, she said. Tomorrow, just tell the truth. That's all you owe anyone. The morning of the hearing, my mother called, and I almost didn't answer. Bracing for another round of disappointment I didn't have the strength to absorb. Instead, her voice was quiet, uncertain. I don't understand this, she said, but I don't want to lose you either. I'll be there today. I sat in stunned silence for a long moment, unsure whether to feel hope or fear, before finally thanking her and hanging up, hands still shaking. At the hearing, the room was full. Teachers, parents, board members, and to my surprise, several former students who had heard what was happening and shown up anyway. Richard Boone opened by reading the morality clause aloud, emphasizing language about conduct unbecoming, and the school's responsibility to uphold certain community standards and expectations. Then he opened the floor, and one by one, people stood to speak, some against me, citing tradition and doctrine, others surprising me with quiet, firm support. A junior named Ellis stood and said I'd been the only teacher who'd ever made him feel like his questions mattered, regardless of who I loved outside class. A parent stood and argued that a teacher's job was to model honesty and courage, not conformity, and that I had done exactly that under enormous pressure. Priya stood too, voice shaking, and finally told the truth publicly, that she was the one who had reported the photo, out of fear, not principle. The room went silent, and she turned to me, apologizing openly, saying she owed the board the truth about her own role, not just my private life. 148. Her confession shifted something in the room, exposing the anonymous complaint as an act of fear rather than genuine concern for student welfare. Then, unexpectedly, my mother stood, hands trembling slightly, and said she didn't fully understand her daughter's life, but she knew my character better than anyone in that room. She has never once failed these children, my mother said, voice cracking, and I won't stand by while you punish her for finally being honest. I stared at her, stunned, tears blurring my vision, as she sat back down, refusing to meet my eyes but reaching over to squeeze my hand once. The board deliberated privately for what felt like hours, while Danny waited outside with me, holding my hand tightly enough to keep me anchored to the moment. When they returned, Richard Boone announced the board had voted, narrowly, to retain my position, citing my record and the outpouring of community support as decisive factors. Relief crashed over me so hard I nearly collapsed, and Danny caught me again, just like she had in that parking lot weeks before, steady and certain. Outside, my mother approached us both, awkward and stiff, and extended her hand to Danny, saying simply, "Thank you for taking care of my daughter." It wasn't warmth. Not yet, but it was a beginning. A small bridge across a distance that had felt impossible to cross only hours earlier. Danny's family situation remained more complicated. Elena still needed time, though Hector began texting Danny small, ordinary things. A quiet effort to stay connected despite his confusion. We allowed ourselves, finally, to breathe. Believing the worst had passed, that surviving the hearing meant we'd earned some measure of peace going forward. That belief lasted almost a month before the next twist arrived, quieter than the first, but somehow more destabilizing than anything that came before it. Danny received an offer from a prestigious nursing residency program in Seattle, a rare opportunity that would set her career on a completely different trajectory. She hesitated to even tell me at first, afraid of what it might mean for us, afraid of asking me to choose between my hard-won job and her future. When she finally showed me the acceptance email, her hands were shaking, and she immediately said she would turn it down if it meant losing what we built. I refused to let her make that sacrifice, insisting we could figure out the distance, though privately the thought of losing her terrified me more than the hearing had. We spent nights mapping out impossible schedules, video calls, holiday visits, budget flights, trying to convince ourselves that love could survive 2,000 miles of separation. Underneath the practical planning, though, an old fear resurfaced in me, that I was, once again, about to lose someone I loved to a life I couldn't fully share. Danny noticed my withdrawal and confronted me directly. "Talk to me," she said. "Don't disappear on me now. Not after everything we've survived together." I admitted my fear honestly for the first time, telling her I was terrified that distance would slowly erode what we had, the way silence once eroded my family. She held my face in her hands and said, "I'm not running from you. I'm running toward the life I want, and I want you in it. However that looks." We decided together, this time as true partners rather than two people bracing separately for loss, that we would try the long distance. With a real plan, I began exploring transfer options seriously, discovering a private school in Seattle actively seeking an English teacher, one with progressive, explicitly inclusive hiring practices. I submitted my application without telling Danny, wanting to surprise her only if it actually worked out, refusing to build hope on uncertain foundations again. Weeks passed in a blur of packing boxes at Danny's apartment, tearful goodbyes with Val, and increasingly frequent video calls filled with time zone confusion and static laughter. The night before her flight, we sat together at the same diner where our relationship had first deepened, both trying not to think about the goodbye waiting outside. "I'm proud of you," I told her, meaning it completely, watching her chase a dream I knew had cost her more than most people would ever understand. At the airport gate, we held each other for a long time, neither wanting to be the first to let go, both crying without embarrassment now. "This isn't goodbye," she whispered. "This is just the next ride. I'll see you soon." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. I watched her walk through security until I couldn't see her anymore, then sat in the terminal for 20 minutes, gathering myself before driving home alone. 2 weeks later, my transfer application moved forward faster than expected, and the Seattle school offered me a position starting the following semester. contingent on final interviews. I didn't tell Danny immediately, wanting to be certain before giving her hope, though keeping the secret during our nightly calls felt almost unbearably difficult. My mother, hearing about the potential move, surprised me again by offering to help pack, saying quietly that she'd rather support this than lose me to silence. "I still don't fully understand," she admitted one evening, folding a sweater into a box. "But I'm trying. I don't want to be the reason you're alone." Her effort, imperfect as it was, meant more to me than any grand gesture could have. Proof that people could grow even after decades of rigid certainty. The final interview for the Seattle position happened over video call, and I answered every question with a clarity and confidence I hadn't felt in years. 3 days later, I received the offer. Full-time. Permanent. With an explicit non-discrimination policy that made the morality clause fight feel like a distant, different life. I called Danny immediately, barely able to get the words out fast enough, and heard her gasp, then laugh, then cry all within the same phone call. "You're actually coming?" she kept asking, as if she needed to hear it multiple times before believing the distance we braced for was ending sooner than planned. I gave my notice at St. Agnes, and Richard Boone, to my surprise, wished me well, admitting the hearing had shifted his own thinking more than he expected. Even Priya, still working to earn back trust, helped me pack my classroom, apologizing again, this time in action rather than only words, box after box. My mother insisted on driving with me partway, an unspoken gesture toward the daughter she was still learning how to fully accept, 1 mile marker at a time. The drive across the country felt symbolic in ways I hadn't expected, each state line a small reminder of how far I'd come from that rainy taxi ride. When I finally arrived in Seattle, Danny was waiting outside the airport, not in a cab this time, but in her own car, grinning like she couldn't believe it either. "Where to?" she asked, echoing our very first conversation, and I laughed, tears mixing with the rain that seemed to follow us everywhere important. "Anywhere," I said, "as long as it's with you." She pulled me into a kiss right there at the curb, leaden, unafraid, exactly as it should have always been. We moved into a small apartment near the hospital where she was completing her residency, close enough to the school where I'd start teaching the following week. Elena, still adjusting, sent a short text a month later, asking for our address, saying she wanted to send something for the new apartment, a small olive branch. Danny cried reading it, and I held her, understanding completely how much even a small gesture could mean after months of painful, uncertain silence between them. My mother visited for Thanksgiving, sitting stiffly at first, but by the end of the meal, laughing at one of Danny's terrible driving stories from her cab days. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, not with either family, but it was real. Imperfect progress built one honest conversation at a time, exactly the way we'd built us. I started keeping a small notebook of moments from my new classroom, students who reminded me why I'd fought so hard to keep teaching on my own terms. Danny finished her residency that spring, accepting a full-time position at the same hospital, choosing to build her whole future in the city that had become our home. Looking back, I realized every twist, the photo, the hearing, the distance, had forced us to choose each other honestly, again and again, instead of by accident. On the second anniversary of that first rainy ride, Danny surprised me with a small box in the same cab she still kept for weekend drives, and asked me to marry her. I said yes before she even finished the question, both of us laughing and crying in the front seat where our whole story had quietly begun. 2 years after a stranger asked where to in the pouring rain, I finally knew exactly where I was going, and exactly who I wanted beside me. Dandy.